Okay, welcome back everyone to the afternoon session. My name is Elif Mueller. I'll be chair with Paul Cizek today for this session. It's a pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the afternoon, Patrick Desrosiers, who like myself studied physics and mathematics, and it seems I just got into neuroscience through a nice book by Steven Strogatz on dynamical systems. Oh dear, my laptop just turns off. Yes, here we go. He co-directs the Dynamical Research Group at the Cerveau Brain Research Center at the Université Laval in Quebec City. His research is in the area of complex systems, focusing on dimension reduction of complex systems and predicting the resilience of large neural networks. And today he'll illuminate us on two new perspectives on structure-function relationships in neural networks.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you also for the organizer. Can you hear me? Is it working? Yeah, okay. It's working. Yeah, so as the title suggests, I will talk about the structure-function relationship. I'm a bit afraid that it's going to be very different from what you heard this morning, especially because it's going to be a bit lower level and a bit more technical, I mean mathematical, but I'll try my best to explain the basic concepts. If you have any questions, please raise your hand and ask the question during my presentation. Yeah. Thank you very much. I don't use the small microphone because I used to teach in big rooms and I tend to yell, so it's very aggressive. I'm very sorry about that. So let me first define what is for me the structure-function relationship. So first of all, it's like you need to answer two basic questions. How does the brain or a network influence the activity of the brain or the function? Here the function is more the dynamics of the brain. And how, when you observe the activity, you can infer the structure or the network behind the activity. And this has been studied for a long time, especially in the last decade or so with the emergence of network neuroscience. And one related concept is the structure-function coupling. This is a way to measure or to assess the structure-function relationship. And here we have a perfect example where on one side you have structural information, so a structural connectome, and on the other side you have recordings of brain activity. And what you typically do is to represent the graph, the structural connectome, as a matrix, a connectivity matrix. And on the other side, you compute the correlation between the brain parts of the activity, and you get a correlation matrix. This gives you a set of values, and then you can map them and try to find a relationship between them. You compute the correlation, and you get a number like 0.4. So one can ask the question, if I see these numbers, is it high or low? And one other good example is in the Laval zebrafish. So I'm very happy to be part of this project with my dear colleague Paul Deconinck at Cerveau Brain Research Center, and Antoine Igaré, who is a student here, who is going to present, he is presenting a poster here at the conference. So I won't talk a lot about this project, but I just want to say that we have a partial information about, thanks to the BIOS lab in Germany, partial information about the connectome of the structural connectome of the zebrafish. So if you use labeled neurons and a brain atlas produced in BIOS lab, then you can produce a mesoscopic, what we call a mesoscopic, or each node here represents a region of the brain, and you get a graph representation of the structure of the brain. At the same time, in Paul's lab, you can do recordings of the activity of the entire brain of the Laval zebrafish, and you get time series like this with 65 regions, And you can compare these activities and compute a correlation matrix, which you can represent as a functional graph. And at the end, you can compare the structure and the function, again represented in matrices, and you get a number like 0.656. Or if you look at the degree, what we call degree in network science is the sum of the incoming connections to a node. So if you prefer, it's the sum of the entries in a row, in each row in the matrix. And you can get a higher correlation in this. So one can wonder, okay, if I look at these numbers, is it high or low? Is it close to a upper bound? Does it exist? Does this number depend on the activity? Actually, I didn't mention, but these numbers are for the spontaneous activity. But of course, if you change the stimuli or if there's movement, maybe you get another value. So this is the kind of question we would like to answer. And the situation is a bit more complicated than that because we know that there are a ton of methods to infer functional connectivity matrices. So we talked about Pearson correlation, which is the standard, the best known, but you can use other methods like Granger causality or transfer entropy, which are well known, and then you get a directed graph with weights, and this is another possibility. But if you want to measure the coupling between a structure and function, then you have many possibilities for the function, the graph that represents the function. So another question is there any way to quantify the structure function that is independent of any type of measure? And the situation also is even more complicated because we know, thanks to the work of Yves Marder and collaborators, that there's degeneracy. It means that if you have many networks, and many of you know that from AI, many different networks can produce the same outcome. So there's no unique relationship between the structure and the function. And this was discovered in network science a few years later, actually 2 years ago, and they realized that, okay, the topology is not so important to predict the activity of the nodes. So if you want to build a model for predicting a time series, and you know that the nodes belong to a network, many networks can be inferred from the time series, and you can get good prediction, not perfect, but good prediction. And as it was realized that this is due to the low-dimensional space on which the activity is occurring. So it means that there's no unique way to go from function to structure, and predicting is maybe easier than what we can expect. So today I'd like to address 4 questions. So first, I'd like to tell how should we measure the structure-functional relationship independent from any method? Is there a limit to the coupling between the structure and function? How does the connectivity between the nodes change the activity of the nodes? And what is the relationship between the structure and the dimensionality of the activity of neurons? Here, when I say neurons, I don't mean real neurons, it's mathematical neurons, or units if you prefer. So I will not answer perfectly to these questions, but I will at least try to answer a little bit. And for this, I will use 2 publications. First one called Duality Between Predictability and Reconstructability in Complex Systems, led by our PhD student, Charles Murphy. And the second one, The Low-Rank Hypothesis of Complex Systems, led by Vincent Thibault, who is going to present a lightning talk tomorrow. And this is a work in collaboration with my dear colleague, Antoine Allard, who is working a lot in network science. So let's start with the first problem. And actually, the answer to the first question is quite simple if you use the proper models in this case. And first of all, the proper model is not to use a single graph, but use random graphs. I mean sets of graphs for which each graph has a probability. So here you have the uniform distribution, but of course you can pose that you have a non-uniform distribution. And if you look carefully, you can see that if you have more triangle here, then you have higher probability. So clustered graphs are more probable. And of course, you can generalize and impose more general models like the stochastic block model, which is used a lot in neuroscience because it can produce modules in networks. But you can also use more generative models inspired by connectomics. So a general random graph with a probability distribution. And then the other quantity I'd like to modelize is the activity. But I won't use a deterministic dynamics. I will use a stochastic process, which is also the way to go if you want to simplify the problem. So for us, x1, is going to be the activity at one time step. And in this representation, the yellow nodes are the active nodes, active neurons, and the blue nodes are the non-active neurons, no action potential. It's an oversimplified system, I'm sorry, but it's simpler for the math. And then at the end, the time series is a matrix that you have. And this actually is a random matrix. So if I want to build a stochastic model, I just select the probability. I can do that for all graph, and my activity model is given by a conditional probability on the graph. So to go further, I need to give more details about the model. There are many ways to model neurons with the stochastic equation. The best known is when you use stochastic differential equation like leaky integrated fire plus noise. But I'm going to use Markov chains, which is simpler in this case. And in this model, I can use my time evolution vector like this. It's a matrix, I'm sorry. And each xi is a vector. And I need to introduce the parameter t, which is the total number of time steps I have. Then I have to define my dynamics. So because it's Markovian, I can use probability transition from one state to another state of the network from one time to another time step. And then the state transition is parameterized by many parameters, I'm sorry. And the first one is the number of neurons, n, it's easy. Then the second one is the activation function for the neurons, and then the beta is the deactivation function. And in this expression, you have m and m is the number of active neurons, neighboring active neurons, and n is the number of non-active neurons. And for the transition probability, you can choose what you prefer, but a simple choice is just the sigmoid function, and you get what we call a Cohen model. It's well known, and don't worry about the indices here or the numerical values. It's just a simple example. But what is important is the notion of coupling, so how much the neurons are going to interact between themselves. So once you have everything stochastic, then it's pretty easy to measure the structure and the function. And for this, you just use information theory. So I remind you that in this classical representation, on one side I have one random variable, which is a graph, a second random variable, which is the time evolution of the states. And in this representation, you have the entropy, which is a measure of uncertainty. So if the entropy is high, then it's very difficult to predict the structure, the graph here. The same thing is true for the dynamics. So if the entropy of X is high, then it's very difficult to predict the outcome of the dynamics. You can define the conditional entropies. So this is the uncertainty related to J, the graph, when I know the dynamics. And once you have this, you can define the mutual information, which is the amount of information that X provides about J and G, I'm sorry. And this is the same also, this is the amount of information that G provides about J. And of course, with that, it's an obvious result that the structure-function relationship in this case is measured by the mutual information. Okay, this is the abstract mathematical, but this is usually not the way we do in that data analysis. So we wanted to compare the mutual information with other measures. So if we look at the problem of prediction, so if we have stochastic dynamics, it's not about predicting the next state perfectly. It's more about detecting what is the probability of transition. And for this, there are lots of tools that you can use. And for instance, you can do a logistic regression or use a multi-layer perceptron to learn, when you have time series, to learn the transition probability. And in this representation, you see that this is the error made by the algorithm that learned the transition probability. And you see that the error is higher when the mutual information, which is coded here in red, is higher, because these methods, they don't include any information about the graph. So they don't use information about the graph, and when they don't use information about the graph, the error is bigger when the structure and the function relationship is bigger. And you can see the same for the problem of reconstructing a network. So if you have time series and you want to guess what is the graph that produced these time series, you can use classical method like Granger causality, correlation, transfer entropy. And when you use these matrices, usually you have to threshold over values, and then you get an area under the ROC curve. And this is a way to measure, okay, how good is my model to detect the structure behind the activity. And you see that they mostly, except correlation, which is always very bad, they mostly follow the information, the mutual information. And if you see a zone, a gray zone with the upper bound and a lower bound, is because evaluating the mutual information is always complicated. So we have estimators that are lower bound and upper bounds. Okay, all that is good, except that it doesn't say everything about the systems. So here I have a representation where I have a higher predictability. So it means that it's very easy to determine the outcome of the dynamics, while I have a very weak reconstructability. And here I have the converse situation. So for this situation, you see that they all share the same amount of mutual information. So you could say, okay, the structure-function relationship is the same, but I cannot say anything about my capacity to predict or to reconstruct a graph. So for this, we introduce normalized uncertainty coefficients. One is called predictability, which is the mutual information divided by the uncertainty about the dynamics, and the reconstructability, which is the mutual information, again, the same quantity, but this time divided by the uncertainty about the graph. In total, you have normalized quantities. And you can see, for instance, that predictability goes to 1 if you have a deterministic problem. So in a deterministic dynamics, if you fix the initial condition, then you know the whole. In principle, you can reconstruct the whole dynamics. So to show, there's something funny that happens when you use this predictability and reconstructability. Here I have a very simple model in which there are only 2 graphs. So imagine that you have only 2 possible branes and only 3 time series that are possible. So there's a lot of parameters here, but let's say that, okay, in the case where this time series is not possible, then I can vary my parameter R, which is the probability to get 1 time series or the other one. And we see that predictability and reconstructability, they both increase with the increase of the probability R. But if we put a little bit more noise in the system, and we said that we have equal probability here, then you see that in some range of R, you have a decrease of predictability while you have an increase of reconstructability. You have a dual behavior. We call it the duality, and this is an important feature for all dynamics we studied. So here I would like to point out that if you do that for a neural network with binary units, with excitatory connections, we know that usually they stabilize to a certain level of activity. So typically you have a stable branch of high activity, a lower branch of low activity. And when you change the gain, which was a parameter of interaction between the neurons, you can switch from one branch to the other, and you have a discontinuous phase transition. I'm telling you that because it appears that the duality occur, oh, you cannot see it, I think. So we've lost some gray zones. So these two lines are related to the threshold of phase transition. And actually, you can see that in these zones, you have typically higher reconstructability, and you have a dual behavior next to these lines here. We should have a gray zone, but it's a systematic observation that duality occurs close to these thresholds of phase transition. And the duality occurs all the time. It's a theorem, so we learned this morning how important it is to have theorem. But we have a few theorems in the paper in which, for this case, we can prove the general duality when the parameter you change is the number of time steps. We call it the T duality. And in this case, when the number of time steps increase, you always have an increase of reconstructability and a decrease of predictability. But you can say, okay, predicting a time series in general is very hard to reconstruct the whole evolution. Maybe we could input more time steps at the beginning. So we can also define uncertainty coefficient where we include information about the past. And if we do so, then in general, we also observe the duality. So if I summarize what we've seen, is that the mutual information serves as a measure of structure-function relationship when both the structure and the function are random. The uncertainty coefficients called the reconstructability and the predictability can have a very different behavior called the duality. And this duality emerges close to phase transition. And the duality universally emerge when you're changing the number of time steps in your analysis. So this was for the first paper. I have 5 minutes. That's good. So I wanted to answer in 15 minutes the two other questions: how the connection between neurons constrains the activity of neurons, and what is the dimensionality of the space-span by the neural activity. And this, actually, I'm very grateful because it's going to be presented tomorrow by Vincent Thibault. So I'll try to find a geodesic, very short path between my next slides. So I just wanted to tell that for us, for years, it was important to talk about dimensionality reduction, but I'm not talking about dimensionality reduction of data sets. It's really about dynamical systems. When you have huge dynamical systems with a lot of differential equations, how can you reduce this number of equations? And when we do that, we were able to do that using matrix methods, spectral decompositions. We always have hypotheses behind the matrix, the connectivity matrix we have to model the complex systems. And we always wonder, okay, is it justified to use these models? And one other motivation for us was about the dimensionality of the neuronal activity. So here I have a very basic cartoonish example where I have xi, which is the firing rate of neuron I. And for 3 neurons, essentially you have 3 simple cases. The activity is 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional. But we know from experience in simulation, experiment in simulation, that the expected dimension of the neuronal manifold should be much less than the dimension of the whole system, which is the number of neurons. So to tackle this problem, we decided to use, again, dynamical system theory, in which we have always a structure of interaction, which is a weight matrix, and you can map this to a high dimensional space in which you have the evolution of the activity. And we observe that in many papers, there's kind of a hypothesis that is hidden that nobody really tell explicitly, but it's there, is that any complex systems analyzed in the papers can be reduced to a few number of equations, and all the structural of interaction can be summarized in a low-rank matrix. So the rank here is the rank of the matrices, so it's the number of linearly independent rows in a matrix. So for those who are familiar with network science, all the known models of network science and many in theoretical neuroscience use actually a low-rank matrix. And we wanted to check if this hypothesis was correct. So to do that, we introduced, I'm sorry, I'm going very fast. We used the singular value decomposition here of a matrix. And what is important is this matrix here. Any matrix can be decomposed as a product of three matrices, as many of you know. And these values are called the singular values. And the number of non-zero values is the rank. Okay? And the rank is related to the dimensionality of the space from the product of the matrix and the vector of activity. So if you have a low rank, then you have a low dimensional space of activity. But of course, a low rank is too simplistic. So a good analogy is with flags. So the flag of France and many European countries have rank 1. England has rank 2. And if you take a more complex flag like the Nunavik flags from the northern Quebec, it's not a low rank itself, but you know that with a few addition of matrices, you will get a good approximation. And this is caused by the fast decrease of singular values. So if you look at this graph, this is the fast decrease of singular values, the one I mentioned earlier. And here you have a high, so if this happens, we call it a low effective rank. And if this decrease, which is slow, happens, then it's a high effective rank. And it happens that if you look at the data, so here I will use the data from connectomics. It happens that all the singular values of matrices that they describe the connectomes, they have a very fast decrease of activity. And one consequence of that is that if you try to simulate activity with these matrices, then you can get a very good representation in low-dimensional space. So I don't want to go into the details, but actually we have theorems that says that if you have a very sharp decrease, then the error committed by the dimension reduction is related to the last. Yes, the angry panda is there. I'm very happy about it. So I will conclude. So at the end, what I wanted to say is that the low-rank hypothesis, it's perhaps not just an hypothesis, but maybe it's anchored in reality. There's some truth to that. And the real networks and connectome, they have low effective rank. They have rank, matrix rank high, but low effective rank, which means a fast decrease of the singular values. And if you have this, then you can expect to have a low dimensional dynamics. I didn't write the equation, but when you do the dimensionality reduction, you realize that you no longer have a graph when you are in the low dimensional space, but a hypergraph. On that, I would like to thank you, and I'm not sure I have time for questions. Thank you.
I think we got time for one question while the next speaker sets up.
Yes.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I have a question. I have a few questions. So, on the first presentation that you said, like you, from what I understand, you create like a synthetic model,
Yeah.
and you randomly create a structural and functional, like structural connectivity, and then you derive the functional connectivity from the structural connectivity. So my question was, that model doesn't seem to be restricted to brains.
No, no,
It's
no.
just
It's a
arbitrary
general
networks,
model
right?
that would work with any graph. And if you want to restrict to brains, then you have to put more conditions on the probabilities.
Oh, I
But
see.
our models were very basic, actually. They were low rank models for this paper.
Oh, I see.
They
And
could be more complex, yeah.
And the second question was, on the second presentation that you gave,
Yeah.
you said it can be reduced to a low rank representation. So, but the low rank, you get the low rank by just applying a single linear matrix, right? So, could it be possible that there's more complex latent or complex low rank representation that you can get from like more complex?
Absolutely. So the dimensionality reduction method is linear in this case. It transforms linearly the activities, but you can imagine that you have nonlinear transformation that gives better approximation. We just use something for which we can prove some theorems about the upper bound of the errors. Is it an answer to your question?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.